Hey everybody, today is Friday, October 4th, 2024. Coming up on the show today, from Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis, editor Cam McLauchlin.
You know, there are many great critics that I've read reviews of this film because I'm trying to understand it myself at times and see other people's sort of view of it. But you can easily be cynical about it, and you can easily sort of pick apart some technical things and classic storytelling elements. But I think ultimately, if you look at it for his hope for the future, it's sort of a beautiful thing. I was standing at the escalator, I'm like, there's Jon Favreau, there's Darren Aronofsky, there's Angelica Houston, there's Al Pacino. I'm like, oh my God, we haven't shown this movie to anyone. He's like, ask me anything. And I said, okay, well, why isn't Walter Murch cutting this movie?
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Well, greetings, my friends. Yes, that's right, a special Friday edition of the show. That's just how the schedule worked out. Boy, do we have an intriguing one to talk about today. And talk is just what this film has been generating ever since it was announced. Not to mention the first time it was screened. The film, of course, is Francis Ford Coppola's decades-in-the-making passion project, Megalopolis. I have no doubt you are familiar with this film, whether you've seen it or not. You already know Mr. Coppola has been dreaming of bringing this movie to theaters for 20-plus years. You are familiar with the fact that he bankrolled the film largely on his own to the tune of $120 million. And you know how the film has confounded critics and audiences with its completely original, unfamiliar take on cinematic storytelling. I will say this, it's nothing like I've ever seen before. At the same time, it's like multiple films I've seen before, all rolled into one. I can't quite recall if this made it into the finished interview you're about to hear, but I mentioned to the editor that the film felt like Mr. Coppola had 3 to 4 different ways he could have made this film, and he chose all of them at once. Speaking of the editor of the film, we are indeed talking to Megalopolis editor Cam McLauchlin today. Now I ask you, who has better insight to how a film came together than the editor? No one. So I think we are very fortunate to have Cam join us today. He was first introduced to me by a mutual friend and frequent visitor to The Rough Cut, editor Greg O'Brien. Greg and Cam are pals from way back. Mr. O'Brien has been on the podcast before to talk about his work on shows like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and this is also a return trip to the show for Cam. He was on a few years ago to talk about cutting Guillermo del Toro's Nightmare Alley. As fate would have it, Cam is back with Guillermo right now working on a special extended cut of that film. Thankfully, the Big G gave him a little time off today to talk with us, so that is just what we will do. Now, what can I tell you about Megalopolis? Well, it takes place in a somewhat alternate universe where New York City is New Rome. It stars Adam Driver as Cesar Catalina, a brilliant artist who somehow has the ability to stop time and has developed a magical material called MEGALON that can build a utopian city of the future. Caesar is at odds with the greedy mayor of New Rome, Franklyn Cicero. Between them is the mayor's daughter, Julia Cicero, her loyalty divided between her father and her beloved Caesar. Well, there you go. Beyond what I just told you, I am not going to describe the plot of Megalopolis in any greater depth. For one thing, I don't think I could. And for another, what is really more to the point of the film are the themes and ideas Francis Ford Coppola wanted to convey. At least that's my opinion. Speaking of opinions, yes, everybody has one. Do the jokes on your own time. But as far as my opinion goes, a question that I get from time to time is, do you really like all the shows and films you feature on the podcast? The answer to that is, it doesn't matter. If all we talked about were the things I liked, this podcast would have never lasted as long as it has. Besides, I'm not interviewing movies or shows. I'm interviewing the people who made them. The movies and shows are just a vehicle for us to do that, and to learn about how these creative people approach their craft. And I do like all the editors, directors, composers, sound designers, re-recording mixers, and dialogue editors we've had on this show, because they are what it's all about. I will add that no matter what I've felt about a show or movie going into an interview with the artist that made it, I always liked it more afterwards. And I have no idea if you're like Megalopolis or not. But I do know you're going to learn a few things from Cam and get a perspective on the film that you can only get from the editor. And we will get that perspective in just a moment. But first, here's my perspective on how you can help your next film or TV show sound positively epic. How about a little epic music to help us do that? You might not have to put $120 million of your own money into your next movie. Do you even have $120 million? If so, call me. I have some ideas. But an idea you can have for free is to get your production audio from our beloved sponsor, Extreme Music. The idea is free, you do have to pay for the music. But first you gotta find the music. Extreme Music has a gargantuan catalog of tracks that you can peruse using their powerful yet easy-to-use search engine. Just by dropping in keywords like tempo, genre, lyrics, composer, era, mood, they'll respond to your request with tracks that you can get in different links, with options for which instruments you want to include. It's their awesome stem mixer tool that lets you do that. And if words escape you, you can skip the search engine and just upload a reference track to Extreme Music, and they will serve you up ones just like it. You can even take care of all the, quote, paperwork right there in their website. Or they could have a rep work with you personally on the licensing. There are fantastic new tunes being added to the mix all the time, so do not wait, young media maker. The next time you have a story to tell it with stellar production audio from Extreme Music. All right then, without further ado, from Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis, here is editor Cam McLauchlin.
And really not give up, which is crazy.
This is true. You know, here's the thing with Megalopolis. So when I go see a movie that I know I'm going to be doing an interview, I take notes. And sometimes at the end of the movie, I look down and there's no notes. And it doesn't mean the movie was good or bad. It just means it didn't really stir anything. At the end of Megalopolis, I had a lot of notes. I don't know what that means, but I tried to turn those notes into somewhat coherent questions. And some are just notes where I'll just say, Cam, this is what I thought. What do you think?
That sounds like you described the process of editing the film.
I kind of figured. Well, last we spoke, I can't believe how long ago it was, you were doing Nightmare Alley with Guillermo del Toro. Ironically, you're kind of doing the same thing now, which maybe we'll get into later. Did your work on Nightmare Alley or your connection to Guillermo have anything to do with how you got the job cutting Megalopolis?
Well, Francis knew Guillermo from, he and George Lucas developed a script with Guillermo, The Count of Monte Cristo, when Guillermo moved to Los Angeles. That didn't really go anywhere, but like any filmmaker, you remain in touch at some point. But Francis really enjoyed Nightmare Alley, and that's how we got in touch. So I met with him in LA and went to his house, and I was shaking at the door, and I knocked, and no one answered. And then eventually some feet shuffled over and he opened up. He's like the warmest, kindest man you could imagine. And I spent 5 hours in his place and we talked about the script, which was sort of mind boggling because you can imagine the script, the version of the script to the screen was also didn't make sense.
Well, it's nice to hear the man opens his own door. You know, there are job interviews, then there are job interviews. What do you talk about with Francis in that 5-hour meeting when you're trying to lock down a position on his crew?
I had no expectations. I was just, it was fascinating to meet anyone like him. And we went through the script and I had taken a ton of notes. So as we became more familiar and had a coffee, I just started throwing stuff out there because like anything, it's like, this is where I'm coming from as a reader of your material, and this is how I react to it. So let's find out now if we can even gel or you want to hear my opinions. And then we watched a bunch of footage that Ron Fricke, who shot material B-roll for Megalopolis in 2000, which then with 9/11 sank the production. So we watched all that material. He had footage of 9/11, which we really debated on using. So we talked a lot about that. And then at one point, he's like, come sit in this massage recliner I have and relax. Like, he's super generous. And he's like, ask me anything. And I said, okay, well, why isn't Walter Murch cutting this movie? And then he said, Walter, this is being very candid, but he said, Walter doesn't like the script. So I said, oh, okay. But he said Walter gave him some great nuggets and some notes. But any chance to walk a path that Walter Murch has tread down and work with Francis, I mean, how can you resist?
You can't. And why isn't Walter Murch cutting this is a fair question for any movie.
Yeah.
Every movie has with it a certain amount of pressure. And every editor also says, my job ultimately is to serve the director's vision.
Sure.
When the director has put all his money into this project and has been working on it for decades, what does that do to the level of pressure?
Well, it's funny because there is no pressure in a way originally. It's very casual, and Francis was very casual, and there's been many reports about things that took place on set, but he was a true gentleman through and throughout. And we would always come back after the day's shooting was over, and we would have a glass of wine and watch the dailies with Roman, his son, who was shooting second unit, and Glenn and I, the other editor. Huge shout out to Glenn Scantlebury, who he and I assembled the film together for the first 7 months. We would take notes and listen to Francis, and we just had him to sort of talk to. We didn't have to talk to anyone else. We didn't have a studio coming by. We didn't have any sort of horse and pony show to put on. But eventually, at some point, you kind of, whether it be like a Robert Evans on Godfather, or any great creative producer is a great asset. So there are checks and balances that you do kind of maybe miss out on. And I'm not saying it needs to be a studio film or anything, but it's like another partner on a level that's dealing differently with the film rather than just the editor and director. So it can get a little tricky in that respect.
Well, I can't imagine that a script by itself was enough to convey what Francis was going for with Megalopolis. Did he give you any kind of look or mood books in addition to the script?
Not really. I mean, he had a lot of key frames from a couple artists, Dean Sheriff and Till Nowak, who were really responsible for building the Megalopolis world. We constantly were looking for it in the edit. I would say out of any film I've ever worked on before, this film was an experiment in the making. Like, the screenplay was just a roadmap or a laundry list of ingredients you wanted to get at the store. Sometimes there were too many ingredients, and pulling out something to make it taste right or be palatable was a trick. There was huge ebbs and flows of taking his ideas and original concepts of design and references, and then trying to truncate that into a story that not necessarily has to be something that people are familiar with, but something that says something about what he wants to say. So that's really the trick of this film. It works sometimes, and at other points it's very difficult because there's a lot, like you said earlier, there's like 3 versions of things happening at once. I mean, much of this film is biography of his own making and his own filmmaking and personal journey. And he's the first one to say that every film that he makes turns out to be something that he's dealing with personally, whether it's losing a son or it's becoming a megalomaniac like Kurtz, and in this case, like an architect and redesigning and shaping a future and asking questions of society. So at different stages and phases of his life, he's sort of manifesting on screen what he's dealing with personally, which makes his art very exciting. And he risks a lot, not just financially, but personally.
Absolutely. You mentioned Murch saying, "Oh, I'm not crazy about the script, but here are some notes." When you read the script, and again, not having that relationship already in place with Francis like Walter does, how did you feel about providing any notes, or did you provide any notes on the script?
Yeah, because Glenn had worked with him before, and I had this with Guillermo, that as someone who's coming up through a director, you sort of tend to have a different relationship with him. Like with Guillermo, it's like kind of like he's my uncle, and I'm trying to like deliver what he wants. And Guillermo's very specific. And then with Francis, well, he's not my grandpa, but he's sort of, in a way, I just decided to go blunt. Like, all right, I'm now graduated to this part of my editing career where I have nothing left to lose. And this guy's putting everything on the line. So we constantly, I wouldn't say fought, but we constantly disagreed later on in the process. For the last 8 months, it was just him and I in the edit suite. So I constantly, and he was too, being an advocate for the audience, but we would have our disagreements.
Well, and I'm sure that's kind of what he wanted. He wants an editor with an opinion and a point of view.
Yeah. One thing Guillermo always said to me is like, if both editor and director think the same thing, then what's the point of having 2 of you in the room?
It's a good way to look at it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the footage. When I was watching the movie, and you mentioned some footage that had been shot in the past of New York, I saw the old Ruby Foo's restaurant in Times Square, which has been closed for 10 years.
Yeah.
What sources did you have already in place to work with when you joined? What footage was there, and what kind of variety of footage was it?
Well, basically because Francis had been developing the script for, the story is like 40 years, but off and on, he'd been dabbling, collecting things, and he would occasionally do cast readings, and he built a miniature set of the catwalk scene. And, I watched through stuff and you'd see like, oh, there's Edward James Olmos acting as the mayor, or there's Paul Newman reading this, or Alec Baldwin reading a quote. Not that we used it, but it sort of was inspiration between daily downtime moments of just picking through the past and really trying to conceive and understand like all these ideas that he had and distill them into something, which led to a lot of experimentation.
Well, that almost seems like, knowing that, the film almost takes on kind of a documentary element where you have all this legacy material that really has no specific intent for itself, that you have to go through and organize. How did you go about organizing and getting through all that stuff to find pieces that you wanted to use for the film?
Well, so another editor who was on board, Robert Schaefer, who's been sort of a mainstay with Francis in Napa. He's kind of like the Swiss Army knife for Francis. Before we even came on board, he went through all the material, organized it, so made our jobs much easier. But as far as using it, I originally didn't want to use any of it. I thought we were going to go shoot New York, but Francis wanted to use it, so get it in there, figure out how to work it.
Was there anything challenging from a technical standpoint? I mean, he's going back a ways with like HD cam stuff, I believe.
Yeah, I think it was the Sony F500. Our VFX producer, Jesse Chisholm, used, starts with a T, I forget. It's like, it polished up the HD material.
I know it's not your side of the street, but do you remember what all the different types of sources were?
We used this RE65 and the Mini. So as far as framing, because obviously there's the triptychs that we have, like the split screens, that inspiration, going back to another question you had, material that he related to was the Napoleon by Abel Gance. We actually shot like 3 strips and laid them horizontally. That was a big inspiration for Francis. I mean, some of it was shot 2:1, I guess, and we would just flip it, but other stuff was just shot regular, and then we just stretched it or had to make it fit or crop it.
I can only imagine the references that Francis Ford Coppola is able to draw upon in terms of just being a film historian. Were you able to keep up with him? You mentioned Napoleon, but did he ever bring up things where you're like, I don't know that?
Oh, constantly. And one of the great things was, I mean, this is a weird side thing, but as we were shooting in Georgia, he had also bought a hotel that he was converting into the All Movie Hotel, which you can now rent at allmovie.com.
Good plug.
So as we were cutting on the main floor during production, doing dailies, we had a projector room where we could screen dailies. Then we had edit suites, assistant edit suites. And then they were doing all the renovations upstairs and building a theater, which we actually mixed in. That was Dolby certified. And we had minimal Atmos ability, but we still had some. So when I think he said every like 2 weeks that the renovation would be over in a month, and 14 months later we were done. We got to move upstairs. But the conceit that the director is basically plugged himself, the main character, Caesar, is Francis, without a doubt. That is him. And at the same time, he's building a hotel and creating like this next sort of idea of everyone's working together, eating together. I would wake up in the morning, walk by his corner suite, go in there, have a coffee with him, and we would talk about the film. We would talk about books that we were reading or shows that we were watching or films that he watched last night or the movie he watched. He's like, saw the latest cut. He would impart a bunch of feelings and ideas that he had, and then I'd go to the edit suite and cut for, a couple hours, and then he would show up and I'd show him a bunch of stuff and kind of translate his ideas into the picture. And then we talk and maybe cut for a couple hours, or we go for lunch. And then, he'd kind of come back later in the day and kick the tires and see what was happening. But it was amazing that his brain has so much faculty and ability to take on so much that he's like, if I have a bad day on set, I know I can go to the hotel and deal with those problems. Those I can manage.
I'm sure he can.
Yeah.
The one format it sounds like he didn't shoot on was film. And that's something I would think, I don't know why, but I would think Francis Ford Coppola would like to shoot on film. Was it just because that format in and of itself is too costly for a self-financed film, or doesn't lend itself to lots of takes or improv?
I would say the latter, because, at $120 million, you'd think he could make any decision he wants. But I think because he shot, another reason, like going back to when I first met him, he's like, oh, so you were the only editor on Nightmare Alley? I said, yeah. He's like, oh, wow. Normally I work with like 4 or 5. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I've never done that. But because I wouldn't say sprays down a scene, that's insulting, but he definitely gets as many angles, and depending on the scene itself, like you need the coverage, but even for a dialogue scene, you'd have a couple cameras running always. It's funny because I cut Julia Coppola's last movie, The Last Showgirl. She shot that on film, and we were watching it at TIFF together, and he saw the Kodak sign, and he's like, "Oh, that was shot on film?" And I said, "Yeah, like, it looked like it was. It was pretty grainy."
One of the choices one can make when going to see the film is there are certain showings you can go to where there is a live interaction between somebody in the audience, presumably somebody that works for the theater, an usher or something, with Adam Driver in the film. How did that come about? Was that something he always had in mind? Did he discover it in the cutting room? And was there ever more than one interaction scripted?
So that whole section of the film, he was in talks with a team at Amazon that helped build Alexa. And his original plan was to build it like an interactive piece, but an audience member could go up on stage and call out a question. And we shot the scene with the leads, and they answered 9 questions in total and gave a bunch of different answers and anecdotes. And the goal was to have like this program that could clearly, if you went up there, you're never going to ask a question that they answered. Like, it'd be pretty rare that it would meet up. And in the film, too, it's such a big break to depart from the movie. Our feeling was just, this can't happen. We can't just have this sidebar for half an hour and have the lights come up and have audience members ask questions. And ultimately, it was just a discussion that Francis wanted to kind of beat out of the script and the idea of utopia and as a discussion, not just a way of life. So what ultimately happened was we screened the film for Adam, and he said, "What the hell happened to that scene?" And I was like, well, it just doesn't fit. So then Francis thought, well, like, let's view something and make it like just about, we had a couple of different versions, but ultimately it just felt like if you just come in on Caesar and he talks about his vision for the future that sort of honored Francis's original conceit of it, his idea, and at the same time it kind of broke more open of the philosophy of the film. And in the mix, though, that's when Francis was like, let's shrink it. And then he called out to an apprentice, he's like, go get a microphone stand and come stand in here. And I was like, Francis, this is not going to work. And I think it's a unique experience. And I think, it's like a 2-pronged thing, because Francis has been chasing this idea of live cinema. And also what makes this movie fascinating in a way is that he's really trying to like break down new doors in storytelling in a way, or have a departure. So to go back to the idea that there'd be a live portion of the film, I thought like the house lights come up and it's distracting and it takes you out of the film. And I think ultimately the idea is pure and it's right. I just didn't agree with it, but it's been fun to see it develop because we've had to take it on the road to all these festivals. And we had D.B. Sweeney, the actor. He was the guy going up every time. And every screening, every theater in Cannes and TIFF, we would have to go in and figure out, okay, like it's going to take this long to get across, and we have to time it with the projectionist. And it's a thing.
Yeah, it's a thing. You know what? He was onto something because it's on social media. Everyone's posting clips of like, look what happened at my screening.
Yeah. No, I would never have taken that leap. And that's what Francis is. Like, so many times in the edit suite, he would say, you want to hear a crazy idea? And I'd be like, yeah, absolutely. And then we would do stuff and I would think, well, this is crazy because A, it doesn't make sense. But like the first couple of times he says, want to hear something crazy, I'm like, of course, I'm not kicking out any idea at all. And he would never kick out a crazy idea I had, or anyone for that matter. But what I quickly learned was that because he's so from the old school of like Steenbeck's, and I got 4 tracks of audio, he can watch the most beat up version of a scene and still extrapolate meaning and identify new creative ways to approach it. And you would watch it for anyone. And as an editor, you're used to seeing stuff that's really crude, but you try his idea and he's like, no, I just want to see what these 2 things have to do and how they impact this thing. And you would go through it, and sometimes it would yield a brilliant idea that you would never really come across. And of course, that's the magic of editing, but to go with him on that trip was always fascinating and inspiring.
Well, you mentioned the parallels between he and Caesar and him buying this, it was a Days Inn, I think, in Georgia that he turned into the all-movie hotel.
.com.
You're living there, you're working there. It's production facility, post-production facility, crew dormitory of sorts. I mean, I think you said it's like, well, I could just roll out of bed and I'm at work. I would also think maybe it's like can be a little tough, like you never really are out of the movie, like you're living the movie constantly. What was the experience like being in that hotel, working and living there?
Great question. It was difficult, but it was also inspiring. And we had so many people come visit us, and I love to cook. And there were some other people there that would love to cook. So Francis called it the cruise ship. Like there was a pool in the back. He was the captain of the ship, and we're all kind of doing our jobs on the crew. Everyone's sort of there and important, obviously. You could leave. Peachtree City has an extensive golf cart path. So you could go ride your bike and go fishing and do all sorts of stuff. And Georgia's quite beautiful and great people. But at some points, as the editor, you feel very beholden to like Francis, and you want to, if he sends you a text in the morning at 6, you're going to think about that text until you get out of the shower, have a cup of coffee and go see him, because you want to help him relieve any stress or take some ideas that he's had in the middle of the night and kind of roll with it and see where it goes. Because there was so much material to go through. I always just feel like I want to keep pressing the material.
I can understand that. One of the many interesting choices, curious choices that are made in the film is what to dig into, what to explain, and what not to. For example, the story doesn't really address some of the magic aspects. Like Adam Driver's character can stop time.
Right.
And he's developed this building material called MEGALON that'll be the foundation, literally, of future architectural development. You don't really explain either of those things, why they're there, why it matters.
Right.
Is that something that was ever debated or ever actually in there that got taken out?
No. If anything, we were adding. The original opening of the film was much more of a documentary style, sort of explained where we were, where we're at, where we're going. It had more of like a newsy style to it, with papers like slapping on screen. And then at some point on a weekend, he and I were working, and he said, all my movies begin with this really big, impactful thing. What we have now it's like archival footage, and it doesn't really hit the audience. So we move that scene up, which therefore really kind of makes it a thing, obviously. But I think metaphorically, there's lots of things in the film and sets, especially, when they're way up in the sky on the scaffolding and they kiss. The sets, it's like a heightened reality. It doesn't look real. The VFX are kind of, shot on the volume. So we kind of just rolled with that as opposed to making it some flashy thing. I talked to my wife about this, but she's like, it's sort of this superhero film, but in a very artsy way, and it doesn't really go and delve into the backstory and explain the science and technology behind things. But I don't think Francis really that was his intention. And I think, he did it in Rumblefish, where Tom Waits is explaining time, and time is, you can't make time, you can't win time, you can lose time. And Lawrence Fishburne has a similar sort of speech. But I think the idea that as an artist, Cesar Catalina is grasping, and it's Francis again, like it's Caesar as Francis. Francis is grasping with time. So I think in a way, those ideas are more personal and biographical as opposed to being something story related, which is, again, another thing that can throw the audience because it's not developed in a traditional way or explained fully, that you walk away feeling satisfied in that classic way.
Yeah, I would say there's not much that's traditional about this film, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Editors often talk about establishing a visual language with the film and teaching the audience how to watch the film. With Megalopolis, I couldn't really decode what that language was. I mean, there's a lot going on. There's not a ton of commonality to the transitions or imagery beyond the triptychs that were inspired by Napoleon. That was used a few times. There was sort of a zoom lens treatment used a few times. Tell me about, if you even endeavored to do this at all, establishing a visual language and what kind of direction you got from Francis in that regard.
That's another great question. I think it was difficult to kind of bring that traditional sense or that sort of rhythmic language and visual sort of language to the cutting style, because it was constantly shifting gears tonally. Characters were jumping out of scenes where characters sort of feel like they exist in that sequence, but then we kind of live in another world where it's treated much differently. You know, we use the irises and we use the triptychs and we use plaques, like we really threw the kitchen sink, and a lot of transitions too. Like, for example, when Caesar is having the vision of the future, and it's sort of like this Marvel comic book flipping piece, which shout out to Steve Fletcher, our VFX editor. He worked on that, did a great job. Then Francis wanted to put in this film burn. And I was like, well, what does that say? And he said, well, it's like one of my favorite things from a film by a famous Swedish director that I love. And so it kind of went in there because it's an homage. So the trick of this movie, as far as like to get to answer your question, is there's so much personal biography to it. There's so much reference and homage to other films that he has been influenced by, that it's such a pastiche of things that to make it feel really harmonious and sort of singular, which it is singular in its own vision and delivery, but trying to answer this and be respectful, because I think there's lots to be gained by watching this movie, but it was a challenge. It's the one thing with this film is, you know, trailers and marketing go so far to kind of help lift off your film, but people think it's a sci-fi, it's a drama. And Francis early on tagged it as a fable because these characters are like heightened things. They're characters. They're not, this isn't like a Gene Hackman in the conversation piece. It's, you know, there's like, it's sort of a big modern Caligula kind of thing. It doesn't have the time to develop a lot of stuff in a way, or given the script the way it was treated, you know, we had to make certain decisions along the way.
Well, you mentioned that Francis said to you, like, hey, I start all my movies with something big. I need something big to begin the movie.
Yeah.
One element that begins the movie is this opening voiceover and text in the form of script on a building. That voiceover element, which does continue throughout, is that something that was debated, added after the fact, heavily scripted going in? How did that all work?
So one interesting thing is, for a while now, I've had this, I think Adobe, I forget what the software was, but it was like kind of early AI, like speech. So you could like type in a sentence and it would read back. I'm not sure if it was in the voice of, but our assistant, Dana, she got into the AI world, and we uploaded all this stuff from Lawrence Fishburne doing audiobooks, as opposed to calling him up every time and asking him to send an iPhone dictation. We could just try stuff. So it was always kind of part of his script to be the narrator, but the final speech and the words were always changing. So we would just type in and upload, and we would get back, you know, performatively, it was a hit and miss situation, but it gave us an idea timing wise, and the possibilities are kind of crazy right now with some of that stuff. It's a dark art.
I mentioned earlier that I had notes, and I try and turn most of those notes into questions. And sometimes I can't. Sometimes it's just a note, and I'm just going to ask you, like, why did this happen? Since we're talking about voiceover, there's a scene where Lawrence Fishburne's character is in this room. Caesar and Julia have left the room, and Fishburne's standing there not talking, and you hear the voiceover. It is the daughter of his rival Cicero standing here, the offspring of Caesar's opposition, and yet there's a pause, and then you see him deliver the line, I like her.
Right.
Could have worked either way. Like, he could have just been standing there being pensive and then just saying, I like her, because it would have fit.
Yeah.
But you choreographed this voiceover leading into the on-camera delivery. I just thought that was interesting. Tell me about that piece.
Yeah, I think it's a bit cheeky and fun, and Francis really liked it. And I think there's a lot of sort of satire and comedy that tonally people don't expect, because again, I wouldn't say the marketing's totally responsible, but it comes off very serious in tone. And when you watch it, you're like, John Voight's a jackass and like he's hilarious, but You never would think that coming into the film. The movie just keeps catching you off guard, like you said, and you can't really take your eyes off of it. And whether that translates to something that yields a lot of fruit or just yields like just a fun ride that turns into some cult classic in a way.
You're right. The movie is funnier than you realize. I mean, there's a lot of, you use the word cheeky. I think Adam Driver's delivery of the line, "Hey, get back to the club," is starting to turn into a meme.
Yeah, yeah.
His riff on pigs in a blanket.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yeah. This is the thing with Francis, is that when you leap into the unknown, you're truly free. Like, that is Francis. Like, he's willing to leap off a cliff and take these chances. As far as his career goes, you look at the past and where he's come to now, to see him have so much fun and have so much vigor and still swinging for new places and ideas, that I think he's sort of, and this is a sidebar thing, but he wrote this book, Live Cinema, and he developed this live TV play. It's like a personal account of his family called Distant Visions. And I think he's sort of departing further and further and further away from the sort of classic storytelling that he knows that he grew up with. He's trying to push things and always go forward. And for example, I was in San Francisco with him and we were going to Napa to work on some stuff. And he was like, "You got to try the new Waymo." I'm like, "What's a Waymo?" He's like, "It's an Uber, but like there's no driver." And he's like, you get in the car and he's like, "This is the future." You know, he's constantly just looking towards like, and he has so much hope for the future and sees so much beauty in it. That's another thing I think with the film, that of course you could be, you know, there are many great critics that I've read reviews of this film because I'm trying to understand it myself at times and see other people's sort of view of it. But you can easily be cynical about it, and you can easily sort of pick apart some technical things and classic storytelling elements. But I think ultimately, if you look at it for his hope for the future, it's sort of a beautiful thing.
Well, I tell you, if there's one movie I'd sign up to watch, it's Francis Ford Coppola in a self-driving car. That would be loads of fun. That Macbeth piece,
right?
Was that always intended to be part of the film? I thought I had read that it was something that it just sort of almost like an acting exercise that Francis gave to Adam, but I could be wrong.
No, you're right. So when Glenn and I got the dailies for that scene, and just to quickly go back to Glenn, because, you know, he was great and I'm so happy to work with him and learn so much from him, that we would go in the morning while Francis was going to call and we would watch the dailies. And then we would talk through the dailies and be like, "Okay, that's great. You know, I'm not sure what that's for or whatever." And then we would both collectively decide, "I'm going to go down that path and I'm going to go down that path." So we'll see there. And I think originally Francis thought that we would take a scene and then, you know, the other editor would take the next scene and we'd kind of leapfrog. But we both wanted to feel like we were aware of all the material because we didn't know what was going to happen with Francis. So, and we were able to keep up with camera pretty well. But that particular day, we saw the Shakespeare stuff, and Glenn, you know, has worked with Francis before on Dracula and Godfather 3. So he has a sense of who he is more than I do at this point. And I just, my instincts were like, well, he's going to ask to see the Shakespeare thing at some point. And Glenn, you know, rightfully was like, this just doesn't make sense at this point in the filmmaking process. And I thought, well, we have the time. I'll cut together the Shakespeare thing. And he said, "Great, you do that." So one day in the edit suite, Francis said, "Do you want to hear a crazy idea?" And I said, "I know what your crazy idea is this time." And he's like, "What? Do you want to put it in Shakespeare?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Okay, well, we have a cut." And I put it up and he said, "Great." And so Adam came in and saw it and he said, "Well, you guys butchered Shakespeare. Like, you're using just the pieces to fit to the storytelling." And I thought, well, you know, his character's manipulating the speech and text to kind of use it in the context. But then Francis says, "Well, let's like flesh it out all the way now." So then I did a version and we kind of thought, you know, maybe Caesar privately is this neurotic kind of Elon Musk type person, but when he's in public, he's this big showman. And it just was fun. And again, it felt into the milieu of Francis wanting to kind of return to the theater roots of his sort of career.
This film has been talked about for a while, even before the first screening. And of course, once the first screening and people started getting word of what this film was like, it's just been in the public consciousness. So in the sense of like getting people to talk about your movie, you guys knocked it out of the park. But one of the elements that came out ahead of time was, I believe, Francis encouraging his actors to improvise and come up with their own elements for the story and contribute those to the story. Can you tell me about that aspect of it? You already said that he likes to shoot a lot of coverage and give you a lot of options in the cutting room. But tell me about those improv aspects. Were there any ones beyond Shakespeare that were significant to you and how they contributed to the film?
Well, for example, when we saw it and it was shot early on in the MSG sequence, shout out to Chris Donaldson, who kind of helped break the back of that sequence with the trip out, was when we were watching dailies, there's this theatrical game that you can play by tug of war. And Francis just had them do that on set, as well as many other, theatrical sort of workshop games. But when we saw that, it was immediately like, okay, that's the movie's saying something now back to us. Like that sort of feels like a thing. Like this feels more wild and interpretive and playful and theatrical. And that's sort of where Francis was trying to figure out where to go and position, his style of storytelling. Because I think one other thing he says and mentions a lot is he's made movies in this style and that style, but never in a style of his own, like completely. Like it's Bram Stoker's Dracula, but this is Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis. So I think, again, going back to the whole putting yourself into your art and taking these risks, it was something where he just went for it and he said it felt right. So, and it felt right watching the footage and the dailies that it was being different.
How long was your assembly and what did you work on with Francis to get it down to 2:15?
So I think we were like 4:20 and it was unwatchable, but we watched it a couple times. But at that point, what Francis did with Glenn and I was he gave me the first half and Glenn the second half. And then we worked on that with Francis kind of piggybacking, or if he had something to show him. So we did that for a couple more months until we had kind of had his director's cut. And that was down to like 2:45. It was a little more palatable and we would have more screenings. And then that kind of like closed the ties there.
So a few times now you've referenced Francis saying to you, hey, Cam, you want to hear a crazy idea? Which, frankly, I think would make a better poster for the movies, just Francis with the bubble who want to hear a crazy idea. But was there anything even more bizarre than what's in the film that didn't make the cut?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There was a sequence, let's say, for example, the scene with Julia and Caesar with the Etta James song at last. That whole section was sort of like, you felt like they've been living together for a long time, but where it fell in the film, it just felt like another departure. Like MSG was a huge departure. We left off with Caesar expanding on these big ideas and where he wanted to take the city and MEGALON and Megalopolis, and then we sort of depart. So we had to rein that in. But that had a dream in it that, spoiler alert, but he like cuts his heart out and gives it to her. And we repurposed that little piece at the end of a section later in the film when he's shot, where it's just like a sort of a picture-in-picture and superimposition. Then there's dream sequences with Mayor Cicero and Julia, where he's like this giant sort of puppet head. If it ever sees the light of day, like Francis always wanted to try to make it work, but again, we had to cut out a lot of stuff in this movie to get it moving. Like you said, there are just so many branches and so many things and ideas. Like Francis's creativity works at a rate that I've never seen before.
Do you get any sense that Francis would want to revisit this at any point, or is he satisfied like, no, this is the movie I wanted to make and this is what I'm giving you?
I can't say for certain. You'd have to ask him, but I think for at least a while, it's definitely the cut. And I know he's very happy with it. And, I think he's challenged a bit by the reception of it, but he's like all of us. We're a little sensitive on the inside, and he wants people to see it. So I think the fact that you also mentioned that it's being talked about so much and people are going to see it, whether they like it or not. That will stand the test of time. We'll see. And whether or not we make some changes, or at some point he does anything, we shall see. But I know once the press is over and everything, I think he's got a couple more projects that he'd like to get off. I'd be happy to see him do that.
I think a lot of people would. When did it hit you that this movie was going to be, I'll just say, different? And were there different levels of it? I mean, as you went further and further into the film, was it a growing sense of this movie is not going to land in a traditional sense? I'm part of something that's just really wild.
Yeah, definitely. There was massive peaks and valleys to the whole process. Okay, this is the biggest independent film ever made that like could crash land and burn, or, it wasn't until really like in early of this year that we started to actually kind of get the cut. I wouldn't say working, but feeling like more of a piece. So like any movie, and I'm not saying what we made is like the ideal perfect thing at all, but I think it honored what Francis wanted and what we could deliver to an audience that would be entertaining and yet be kind of protein filling and give them lots to think about and consider, and visually the language of it, because he swung for the fences all over the place, and the performances and the tone. And again, to go back, it's a fable. Like it's one of these films that if you have all these expectations and the weight of the world on it and you go to see it and you're not in tune with it, you're going to crash and burn. But if you just open up and kind of go for the ride, I think it does yield some beautiful things and the messaging that Francis wants.
Not being a studio-backed film, did you have any kind of traditional screenings or any audience screenings for people not involved with the film or not in the industry?
We did one early on, and it was pretty painful. And then we kind of went into hiding, and we went dark. Nobody saw it. And then there was this sort of now famous screening at City Walk in LA where, I was waiting for some friends to show up. I was standing at the escalator. I'm like, there's Jon Favreau, there's Darren Aronofsky, there's Angelica Houston, there's Al Pacino. I'm like, oh my God, we haven't shown this movie to anyone. That was a nerve-wracking experience in a good way. It was fun, and you always learn stuff from screenings. But we were pretty wet when we showed that, and it was humbling.
Well, any specific notes or feedback from any of those directors that had seen early screenings that you could recall? Yeah,
I mean, we showed the movie really only before that screening to a couple people, Guillermo and Steven Soderbergh, and they both thought it was the wildest thing that they've ever seen in their lives and the most craziest thing ever shot on American soil. So in a way, that was reinforcing.
What is it you think Francis ultimately wanted to say with this film?
I mean, ultimately, it's a very personal film, so I think to him, we touched on it before, but it's he made it for himself, and like you're literally walking through the film and you're like, this is Francis's interior dialogue. But as far as a legacy, not that his ego has anything to do with this, but I think as far as where the state of cinema is, where the state of Hollywood is, streamers, Francis isn't trying to like blow any system up because he's always been like this. It's not like he's all of a sudden trying to take a swing and blow up the Death Star, but he's trying to say that cinema is far from over as far as form and style. Of course, there's many filmmakers that push the boundaries, and I'm not saying Francis is the only one, but as far as like putting your money where your mouth is and trying to kind of go after like a bigger, like this is a huge release for Lionsgate, all these screens in IMAX. It's definitely saying something to future filmmakers that you don't need to make. Not that there's anything wrong with those movies, but they're probably also coming to an end in a way. And I think Francis is saying you can make big budget films that are personal, and maybe we return to more like a 70s style where, you could take 120 million and give it to 10 filmmakers and have them say something personal.
Well, I ask this question at the end of about every interview, but I have to say my curiosity is peaking for this particular one. What did you learn, either about your craft or about the business or about life, from working with Francis?
On a personal level, the movies I've cut before, even working with Guillermo, you're like, it's more of an independent. It's always been independent for me, even though like they might be bigger films, but the buck stops with the director, which that to me is the ultimate gift as an editor, to really have that collaboration on this movie in particular, because there were so many people involved in the collaboration and they've all been amazing people. And special shout out to Gretchen Schroeder, my first assistant editor. She ran the cutting room. There was just so much politics involved, even though it's not a studio film. It became pretty tricky, and I felt like at times I was learning, this job can sometimes be like 20% editing and 80% of the other stuff, dealing with everything. But as far as like what I learned from Francis, just the art of collaboration and the ability to really treat, like, every department has a serious role in the art of it. And he definitely looked upon all of us to deliver and be artists involved, and not just technicians or craftspeople. It was more like the ability to really go outside the box all the time and think and get into his sort of pattern and process of how he looks at the world and what's possible, because it's almost like anything's possible when you're with Francis, because if you think it, you can will it in a way.
Well, going back to my my favorite bit, or one of my favorite bits about Caesar's take on pigs in a blanket in the film, how was the craft services? You'd think that Francis Ford Coppola would have pretty great food and some pretty good wine.
Yeah, I was never on set, but yeah, that's what I heard. When I was on set, he has this thing called the Silverfish, which is this famous sort of Airstream trailer, and it's connected to the set, and you can edit live tap off the cameras, and it's kind of like living in there on a couple days, but mostly we were just back at the allmoviehotel.com cutting.
Well, I mean, you live together, you work together. It sounds like you were a pretty tight-knit crew. I mean, you got a pretty good flow under that hat going right now, but during the film, did you have a Caesar cut in solidarity with the male cast members?
No, just much longer. Become slowly chipping away at the hairline.
It's happening to all of us.
Yeah.
If I had hair like Cam's, I wouldn't cut it either. But you do hear about teammates growing beards or shaving their heads in solidarity. What's wrong with everyone on the team having a Caesar haircut? Aside from looking ridiculous. Please join me, won't you, in extending a great big thank you to Cam for coming on the show today and giving us a peek into the cutting room of this much talked about movie. Cam did a ton of work on this film, and then Gia Coppola's movie, and then back to work with Guillermo del Toro. Yet he still managed to squeeze us in. He must really like you. I like you too. I do. That's why I always tell you that you owe it to yourself to get up to speed on all the latest Avid Media Composer has to offer you as an editor. As a plumber or a gym teacher, it can't offer you much. But when it comes to editing, look out. Deep, deep editing tools that have been refined for over 30 years by the world's top editors. It's an editing system that doesn't even flinch when facing massive film projects with mountains of footage like Megalopolis. But you don't have to be cutting giant movies to enjoy all that Media Composer can do for you. So start enjoying it today. Get on over to the Media Composer page on avid.com to see what's waiting for you. And thus concludes another episode of The Rough Cut. And with that, I conclude as well. I got to get back to work. And also get back to putting another show together for you. I hope you come back and check it out. And while you're at it, check out the Rough Cut YouTube channel too. Lots of little gems over there. Every now and then I do a video edition of this podcast. And then there are the editor-guided tours of Avid timelines. Good stuff. I think you'll like it. All right, stop talking, dude. Until we meet again, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.